Baby girl found a German shepherd covered in paint. What happened next melted hearts. Imagine a moment so raw, so real, it shatters the silence of an entire town. A single act of bravery turns into a miracle, proving that love can heal even the deepest wounds. If you've ever doubted kindness, this is the story for you. Like, share, and subscribe to see what happens next. The street was unusually quiet that afternoon, as if the world itself had slowed down for a moment of stillness. The sun spilled its warmth gently across the narrow lane, painting the old brick walls and the weathered wooden fences in golden hues. It was the kind of street where neighbors still greeted each other by name, where the sound of children's laughter carried like music through the air, and where life seemed untouched by the rush of the outside world. On the edge of that street, a little girl no more than 3 years old waddled along in her tiny sandals, giggling as she chased after the fluttering shadow of a butterfly. Her pigtails bounced with each step, and her hands clapped in innocent delight at every small discovery. A dandelion pushing through the cracks of the pavement, a pebble shaped like a heart, the soft chirping of a bird perched on a wire above. To her, the world was a playground, and every corner carried a new surprise. Her mother sat on the porch steps a few yards away, watching with a fond smile. In small towns like these, safety felt like an old friend, dependable, always present. But that day, safety was an illusion. For just beyond the corner, hidden in the shadow of an abandoned shed, was something no one expected. Something that would turn an ordinary afternoon into a memory carved forever into the hearts of an entire community. The girl's laughter slowed when her curious eyes caught sight of something unusual. There, crouched against the wall, sat a German shepherd. But this was no ordinary sight. His once proud coat was covered in thick, uneven streaks of bright paint, blues, reds, and yellows smeared together like a cruel parody of art. It dripped from his fur in hardened clumps, staining his body, masking his natural beauty. His eyes, however, told a different story, weary, tired, yet still carrying a softness that begged to be seen. The little girl stopped, her tiny feet planted firmly on the pavement. She tilted her head, her brow furrowing in confusion. In her world, dogs were playmates, creatures of warmth and wagging tails. But this dog, this noble animal, humiliated and broken beneath the garish colors, seemed more like a painting that had bled into tragedy. She didn't scream. She didn't run. Instead, her lips parted, and with the quiet honesty only children possess, she whispered, "Doggy." The shepherd lifted his head slowly, as if that single word, that tiny voice, had pierced through layers of exhaustion. His ears twitched. His gaze met hers. And in that moment, something unspoken passed between them, the recognition of innocence, the meeting of compassion with silent suffering. From the porch, the mother shifted uncomfortably, sensing her daughter had paused. "Sweetheart, what did you find?" she called out, her tone light but laced with curiosity. The little girl didn't answer right away. Her eyes remained fixed on the shepherd, on the thick coat of paint that seemed less like an accident and more like a deliberate act. And deep in her small heart, something stirred, a question far bigger than her age could comprehend. Why would anyone do this? That day would not remain just a curious memory of a child stumbling upon a dog in distress. It would grow into a story that touched everyone who heard it, a story that reminded people of the cruelty the world is capable of, and the innocence that has the power to heal it. For what the baby girl saw that afternoon didn't just change her life. It softened the hearts of an entire town. It was the kind of day that people often remember fondly when they look back on simpler times. A day when the sun was warm but not harsh, when the breeze carried with it the faint scent of lilacs from gardens well kept, and when the sound of children's laughter seemed to echo across every corner of the neighborhood. The town itself was small, the kind where every house had a front porch with wooden steps worn smooth from years of use, and every window seemed to hold a curtain that swayed with the rhythm of the wind. The street was lined with maples and oaks, their branches stretching like protective arms over the narrow road. Birds perched high, chirping their own melodies as if to add music to the hum of the afternoon. On one side, old Mrs. Higgins tended to her roses, her wide straw hat tilting forward as she leaned down to pluck away weeds. A couple of houses down, Mr. Parker was polishing his old bicycle, the same one he had ridden to school decades earlier, now a keepsake of another era. Neighbors waved casually as they passed, unhurried, with the ease of people who knew one another's stories and carried no need for pretenses. Amid this quiet harmony, a little girl played in the small patch of yard in front of her family's home. Barely 3 years old, she was a picture of innocence. Her cheeks were flushed from running, her hair tied in uneven pigtails by her mother's hurried but loving hands. She wore a yellow sundress, the kind that fluttered with every playful twirl, and her tiny feet were slipped into shoes a size too big, making her every step a clumsy adventure. In her arms she clutched a soft toy rabbit, its fur faded from countless hugs and bedtime stories, and on the ground nearby sat a collection of plastic blocks, towers she built and toppled with giggles of delight. Her world was simple. A butterfly landing on a flower was a miracle. A bird darting past was a thrill. The crack in the sidewalk where ants marched in a neat line was a story worth watching. She moved from one fascination to the next with the energy only a child could have, filling the air with her high-pitched laughter that rang like bells through the otherwise quiet street. Her parents watched from the porch, sipping iced tea from tall glasses that glistened in the sunlight. They spoke in hushed tones about groceries, the neighbor's new car, and the upcoming town fair, but their eyes often drifted back to the child, their smiles softening every time she squealed or called out to show them something she had found. For them, this was the essence of happiness, not grand vacations or expensive gifts, but afternoons like this, where time slowed and family felt like the entire universe. As the baby girl toddled toward the edge of the yard, something unusual caught her eye. At first it was just a smear of bright color along the sidewalk, a streak of red that seemed oddly out of place against the pale gray cement. She crouched down, her small fingers hovering just above it, curious but hesitant to touch. From where she sat, the red seemed shiny, thick, almost like spilled paint. And next to it were more smudges, blues and yellows and greens, scattered like clumsy brushstrokes. Her little mind tried to piece it together. To her, colors belonged in her box of crayons or on the pages of her coloring book, not dripping across the ground. She stood, wobbling slightly as she steadied herself, and followed the trail. Tiny footprints, not hers, not human, pressed faintly into the paint, leading toward the corner of the street. She tilted her head, clutching her rabbit tighter against her chest. The colors continued, almost like a secret path waiting for her to discover. With each step, she grew quieter, her laughter replaced by wide-eyed curiosity. The breeze ruffled her dress, but she hardly noticed. Her sandals tapped lightly on the pavement as she moved closer to the corner, the bright streaks of paint pulling her along like a story unfolding one line at a time. From the porch, her mother noticed the change. "Sweetheart, where are you going?" she called gently, but the girl didn't answer. Her eyes were locked on the painted trail, her small heart thudding with excitement she couldn't quite name. To her, this was no longer just an ordinary afternoon. This was an adventure, and adventures, she knew in her childlike way, always led to something extraordinary. The neighborhood around her remained serene, Mrs. Higgins humming softly as she watered her roses, Mr. Parker still polishing his bicycle, the birds still filling the air with song. Nothing in the atmosphere suggested anything out of the ordinary. And yet, for one tiny girl, the world had shifted. The spilled colors, the strange footprints, the pull of the unknown, all of it wrapped around her with a sense of mystery that no one else seemed to notice. She reached the corner at last, her small hands pressing against the wall as she peeked around, her breath catching in her throat. What she saw in that moment would silence her laughter, widen her eyes, and change the course of the day, and perhaps, in ways no one yet understood, the course of many hearts. For there, waiting in the shadows, was the reason for the trail of paint. But that discovery was still a heartbeat away. The little girl's breath hitched as she leaned forward, her tiny frame hidden against the wall's edge. At first, she thought it was just another splash of color, maybe a bucket tipped over by accident, or some careless hand spilling paint where it didn't belong. But then the colors moved. Slowly, heavily. And in that instant, her innocent world shifted into something strange and unforgettable. There, crouched on the ground, was a German shepherd. His body was strong in shape, but frail in presence, as though the life in him had been drained away. His fur, once noble and thick, was smeared with blotches of red, blue, yellow, and green paint. The streaks clung to him like cruel graffiti, matting his coat in hardened patches, dripping across his legs, staining his tail. Some of it had dried into stiff clumps, pulling at his skin. Other parts were still wet, glistening under the sun as though mocking the natural beauty of his coat beneath. His chest rose and fell with labored breaths. Each exhale sounded heavy, almost like a sigh of defeat. His eyes, though, those eyes carried the weight of the moment. Dark, deep, tired, they looked out from beneath paint-stained brows with a mixture of confusion and sorrow. They weren't the wild eyes of a stray, nor the sharp, protective eyes of a guard dog. They were softer, pleading in silence, as if he were asking the world, why? Why this? Why me? The baby girl stood frozen, clutching her rabbit tighter against her chest. For the first few seconds, she couldn't understand what she was seeing. To her, dogs meant wagging tails, warm fur, and playful barks. This one was none of those things. He didn't run to her. He didn't bark in joy. He just sat there, still and solemn, covered in colors that should have belonged to drawings and canvases, not to the body of a living creature. Her lips parted in amazement. She took a careful step closer, her sandals brushing against the painted footprints on the ground. The closer she came, the stronger the contrast became. Her bright innocence against his weary form, her yellow dress against the unnatural colors that smothered him. The shepherd lifted his head weakly. His ears twitched, though they didn't rise in alertness the way dogs usually did. His gaze locked onto hers, not sharp, but searching. And in that gaze, something stirred inside the girl. Confusion first. Why does he look like this? Then fear. Is he dangerous? Will he bark? But that fear melted quickly into something else. Compassion. Because what she saw in his eyes wasn't threat, but exhaustion. Not anger, but longing. Her mother's voice floated faintly from the porch. "Sweetheart, are you all right?" But the girl didn't respond. She couldn't. Her tiny heart was pounding, caught between the strangeness of the scene and the pull of something she didn't have words for yet. All she knew was that she couldn't turn away. The shepherd's body trembled slightly, his paws shifting as though even sitting had become a burden. A streak of blue paint clung to one paw, trailing behind him like a scar. His nose, once black and proud, was streaked with red paint that had hardened around the edges. And yet, beneath the mess, the dog's dignity still lingered. His posture, though weak, carried the ghost of strength. His eyes, though dim, carried the shadow of loyalty. The girl's brow furrowed. Her toy rabbit slipped a little from her grasp, dangling by one ear. Without thinking, she took another step forward. Her sandals clicked softly against the pavement. She whispered almost inaudibly, "Doggy." The word cut through the silence like a bell. The shepherd's ears moved again. His eyes blinked slowly, as if that small voice had reached a place deep within him that no one else had touched. For the first time in what may have been hours, maybe days, he stirred. His head lifted a little higher. His chest rose with a deeper breath. And though he made no sound, the space between them filled with something that words could not describe. Her small hand stretched outward, trembling slightly but unwavering in intent. Her mother's warnings about "don't touch strays" whispered faintly in her memory, but the pull of her heart was stronger. She didn't see a threat. She didn't see dirt. She didn't even see the frightening mask of paint. She saw a friend who had been hurt, a creature in need of kindness. And then, the line that would echo in the hearts of those who later heard the story. Where others might have looked away, her tiny hands reached forward. The dog didn't flinch. He didn't growl or back away. Instead, he leaned, ever so slightly, toward the little girl's touch. It was not dramatic. It was not loud. But it was enough. Enough to show that beneath the layers of humiliation and exhaustion, there was still trust left in him. Fragile, trembling, but alive. The girl's fingers brushed against his fur. It was rough, sticky with hardened paint. She pulled her hand back quickly at first, startled by the strange texture. But then, with a child's determination, she reached again. This time, her palm pressed gently against his paw, sticky and stained though it was. She smiled, the kind of smile only innocence can create, one that carried no judgment, only acceptance. The German shepherd closed his eyes for a moment, as though surrendering to her small act of kindness. His breathing slowed, deepened. A quiet stillness settled between them, fragile yet profound. From the porch, the mother rose to her feet, sensing that something was happening, something she didn't yet understand. She called out again, her voice louder now, but the little girl didn't turn back. She was lost in that sacred moment, standing before a dog covered in paint, a dog forgotten or discarded by someone else, yet recognized and accepted by her without hesitation. It was the beginning of a bond no one could have predicted. A meeting not of chance, but of meaning. For that baby girl's innocent compassion was about to awaken a story that would ripple far beyond the quiet street, far beyond that summer afternoon. Because sometimes the smallest hands hold the greatest power to heal. The little girl's small hand lingered for just a moment longer on the shepherd's paw before she suddenly pulled back, her heart racing with the enormity of what she had discovered. Her eyes darted toward her house, and in a flurry of tiny footsteps, she turned and ran as fast as her sandals would carry her. "Mommy! Daddy!" she called out in her sweet but urgent voice, stumbling a little as she rushed up the steps. Her cheeks were flushed, and her toy rabbit dangled forgotten at her side. Her mother, startled by the sudden panic, set down her glass of iced tea. "What is it, sweetheart? What's wrong?" The girl pointed back toward the corner, breathless, trying to explain in the jumbled language of a child. "The lays there all over him." Her father chuckled softly, assuming it was just another colorful piece of imagination. "Paint? On a dog?" he said, shaking his head. "Maybe you just saw some dirt or mud, honey." But the girl's wide, tear-brimmed eyes pleaded otherwise. She tugged at her mother's hand, insistent. "No, Doggy's there. He's sad." Curiosity overcame skepticism, and the mother stood, brushing off her apron. "All right," she sighed. "Let's go see what you found." Together, the family walked toward the corner. At first, her parents expected nothing more than a mess left behind by careless teenagers, maybe an overturned paint can or a mural sprayed on a wall. But as they rounded the corner, the sight that met their eyes forced them into silence. There he was, the German shepherd, sitting solemnly against the wall, his fur drenched in colors that didn't belong to him. The little girl had not exaggerated. If anything, her words had not captured the true depth of the tragedy before them. The mother gasped softly, one hand covering her mouth. The father's brows furrowed, disbelief now replaced by concern. "Good Lord," he muttered under his breath. The shepherd didn't move as they approached. His chest rose and fell with heavy breaths, his body trembling under the weight of exhaustion. Around him, the trail of paint told its own story. There were paw prints smeared along the sidewalk and streaks up the wall where he must have brushed against it, too weary to care. Near the edge of the alley sat an empty bucket tipped on its side, streaked with the same garish colors now clinging to his body. It wasn't just an accident. Someone had done this. The father knelt slowly, careful not to frighten the dog, though the shepherd showed no signs of aggression. He didn't bare his teeth or growl. He only watched, eyes tired and distant, as though the fight in him had long since drained away. By now, the neighbors had noticed the small gathering. Curtains twitched open, doors creaked, and within minutes, several people had wandered over, drawn by curiosity. Old Mrs. Higgins left her roses unattended, her hat bobbing as she hurried closer. Mr. Parker leaned his bicycle against a fence, shaking his head as he muttered something about terrible shame. Children peeked from behind their parents' legs, whispering in hushed voices. But none of them stepped forward. They stood in a cautious circle, hesitant to come too near. Some were afraid the dog might bite. Others simply didn't know what to do with such a pitiful sight. Compassion warred with fear, and fear often won. The little girl, however, stayed where she had been, right at the edge of the shepherd's reach, her eyes wide, her tiny hand stretched toward him again. She didn't see a threat. She saw a friend who had been wronged. The murmur of the crowd rose around them. "Poor thing looks half-starved. Who would do such a cruel thing? Maybe he wandered into a construction site? No, look at that bucket. Someone poured it on him. On purpose." The words swirled in the air, heavy with judgment and disbelief, but none of them changed the image before their eyes. A noble creature reduced to a spectacle of humiliation. The paint itself carried an eerie symbolism. Bright, cheerful colors meant to create art or joy had instead been turned into a mask of suffering. The reds, blues, and yellows covered the shepherd's natural coat like lies layered over truth, hiding his identity, erasing his dignity. To some, it looked almost grotesque, like a clown painted against his will. To others, it was a cruel metaphor for how easily beauty could be buried beneath ugliness when left in careless hands. The father shook his head again, muttering, "He's not just dirty. Someone tried to erase him." And in that sentence lay the weight of it all. The shepherd shifted slightly, his paw dragging against the cement, leaving another streak of paint behind. The sight drew a gasp from one of the neighbors, but the little girl only stepped closer. Her parents moved instinctively to stop her, but before they could, she crouched down, her tiny knees pressed to the ground, and whispered again, "Doggy." This time, the dog blinked slowly, as though acknowledging her persistence. His breathing steadied for a moment, his eyes softening in the presence of her innocence. Where the adults saw filth and danger, she saw only a creature in need. It was then that the crowd began to shift. One by one, the hesitant looks gave way to murmurs of pity. Someone brought a blanket. Another fetched a bowl of water. A teenage boy ran to call the town's small veterinary clinic. What began as disbelief was slowly turning into collective concern. all sparked by the unwavering compassion of a child. The little girl, however, wasn't thinking about what the others were doing. She was still focused on him, this painted, broken shepherd whose true self was hidden beneath layers of color. She didn't know the word for it, but she felt it. The unfairness of being judged by what was on the surface rather than what was within. For the first time, she reached her hand fully, resting it on his paw despite the sticky paint that clung to her fingers. He didn't pull away. He simply accepted her touch. And in that quiet gesture, the truth broke through the illusion. He was not the paint. He was not the humiliation forced upon him. He was still a noble creature, worthy of love, waiting to be seen. And she saw him. The murmurs of the gathered neighbors grew louder as the gravity of the scene began to settle over them. The German shepherd sat slumped against the wall, his chest heaving with effort, his body trembling under the weight of both exhaustion and humiliation. The bright colors clinging to his fur weren't playful anymore. They were menacing, toxic. Some of the paint had already crusted stiff, pulling harshly at his skin, while other patches still dripped in thick streaks, leaving trails across the pavement. The closer one looked, the clearer it became. This wasn't just paint. It was a punishment, deliberate and cruel. The girl's parents exchanged a quick glance, and in that wordless exchange, the father pulled out his phone and dialed the nearest veterinary clinic. "We've got an emergency," he said firmly into the receiver. "The dog, German shepherd, covered in paint, looks weak, malnourished. Yes, he's barely moving. Hurry, please." Meanwhile, a teenage boy sprinted toward the animal shelter across town, while Mrs. Higgins returned with a thick woolen blanket, muttering, poor soul," under her breath as she draped it over her arms, ready to use it if needed. The crowd's hesitation was giving way to action now. Even those who had initially hung back, nervous or skeptical, felt the pull of something greater than fear, compassion. And at the heart of it all was the baby girl, who had not once left her place beside the shepherd. She crouched low again, her small knees pressing against the rough pavement, her little fingers reaching through the streaks of hardened paint to rest gently on his paw. At first, the shepherd didn't move. His eyes remained half-closed, his breath shallow. But she leaned forward, whispering in the only language she knew, the language of pure innocence. "It's okay, doggy," she murmured, her voice no louder than a lullaby. "You're not alone. I'm here." The dog's ear twitched faintly. His paw shifted, almost imperceptibly, beneath her hand. Her breath caught in wonder. "Mommy!" "He moved," she exclaimed softly, her voice filled with joy that no adult had felt yet. To her, it was a miracle, proof that her new friend could hear her, that her words mattered. Her parents moved closer, kneeling on either side of her. The mother placed a cautious hand on her daughter's shoulder, torn between pride at her child's courage and fear for her safety. "Sweetheart, we should let the helpers handle this." But the little girl shook her head, her pigtails bouncing. "No. He needs me." It was hard to argue with that kind of determination, especially when the shepherd's paw gave the faintest squeeze against her tiny fingers, as if agreeing. Minutes later, the sound of hurried footsteps echoed down the street. The local vet, Dr. Harris, arrived with a small team carrying medical kits. His brow furrowed deeply as he knelt beside the shepherd, his gloved hands carefully examining the matted fur. "This is bad," he muttered, his tone professional but grave. "The paint is toxic. It's irritated his skin, might have gotten into his eyes or mouth. He's severely dehydrated and weak from lack of food." The neighbors gasped softly, some shaking their heads in disbelief. How could anyone allow, or worse, such suffering? The vet began working quickly, pulling out saline solution and soft cloths, trying to clean small patches of fur to relieve the irritation. The shepherd winced but didn't resist, his tired body surrendering to the touch. Dr. Harris sighed. "We'll need to sedate him soon and get him to the clinic. This isn't something we can fix out here." Through it all, the little girl refused to move. She sat firmly by the shepherd's side, her small hand never leaving his paw. Every so often, she whispered words only he seemed to hear. "You're a good doggy. You're strong. Don't give up." And each time, his breathing seemed to steady, if only a little. His eyes, clouded with exhaustion, would flutter open to meet hers, and in those moments, a fragile bond of trust deepened. It was as if her innocence was the anchor holding him in this world, keeping him from slipping into the shadows. The neighbors watched in awe, realizing that while they brought blankets and water, while the vet brought medicine and tools, it was the child who brought something no one else could: hope. Then came the detail that deepened the mystery. As Dr. Harris gently turned the shepherd's neck to examine him, his fingers brushed against a collar hidden beneath the crusted layers of paint. Wiping it clean with a cloth, he revealed a battered metal tag. The inscription was faint but still legible. The vet read it aloud softly. A name, a phone number, and below that, a word that made the crowd murmur, "Tang." This was no ordinary dog. "Looks like he was trained," Dr. Harris said gravely. "Police or military, maybe. Whoever did this didn't just hurt any stray. They tried to erase a noble animal's identity." The words hung heavy in the air. Suddenly, the paint took on a darker meaning. It wasn't just cruelty. It was an attempt to bury his past, to strip away the dignity of a dog who had once served and protected. The father clenched his jaw. Who would do such a thing? No one had an answer, but suspicion lingered in their eyes. Someone in town might know. Someone might have seen. The truth was out there, waiting to be uncovered. For now, though, there was only one mission: save him. As the vet prepared the stretcher, the baby girl leaned down once more, pressing her cheek briefly against the shepherd's paw. Her voice, trembling but firm, whispered, "Don't worry. We'll find out who you are. We'll help you." And for the first time since they had found him, the German shepherd moved more than just his paw. Slowly, painfully, he lifted his head and nudged his nose against her tiny hand, leaving a faint streak of paint on her skin. It was a gesture so small, yet so monumental that the crowd collectively held their breath. The mother felt tears sting her eyes. The father swallowed hard, his own composure faltering. Around them, neighbors shifted uneasily, their skepticism replaced by respect. The shepherd had chosen. Out of everyone present, he had responded to the baby girl. The stretcher was brought forward, and carefully, with steady hands, the vet and his team lifted the weakened dog onto it. He didn't resist. His eyes never left the little girl, even as the blanket was draped over him and the team prepared to move. The girl tried to follow, her tiny legs scrambling, but her mother scooped her up gently. "He'll be okay," she promised softly, though her voice cracked. The child's hands reached desperately toward the shepherd as he was carried away. "Don't leave him. Please, Mommy, he needs me." Her cries pierced the air, and in them, everyone felt the truth. This was no ordinary connection. Something bound that child and that painted shepherd together, something far beyond chance. And as the vet's van pulled away, carrying him toward safety, the town was left in silence. A silence heavy with questions, with anger at whoever had done this, and with the faintest glimmer of hope that this story was only just beginning. Because somewhere within the streaks of paint, hidden beneath layers of cruelty, lay a truth waiting to be revealed. The vet van rolled up to Dr. Harris's clinic, and the back doors swung open to a rush of cool, sterile air. A small team of volunteers, groomers, shelter workers, a retired nurse, were already waiting with tubs, towels, and careful hands. Floodlights hummed to life over the back bay, turning the twilight into a bright, makeshift theater. On the stretcher, the German shepherd trembled. Paint cracked where it had hardened, tugging at his skin like shackles that refused to let go. "Slow and steady," Dr. Harris said, voice low but firm. He glanced at the parents. "She can watch from behind the glass. If he hears her, it may help." The mother swallowed, then nodded, helping her little girl into a tiny paper gown and a pair of too big shoe covers. The father lifted the child to the clinic's viewing window, where her breath made a foggy circle on the glass. Inside, the volunteers moved with the quiet choreography of people who cared deeply and didn't want to make a single mistake. Bowls of warmed oil and water sat beside gentle cleansers and saline. Soft brushes waited like instruments in an orchestra pit. Dr. Harris began at the edges, around the ears, along the jaw, where the skin was most fragile. A volunteer dabbed a cloth, pressed, and lifted. Color bled into the fabric. Red, then blue, then a bilious green that had no place on a living creature. The shepherd whimpered, and the sound thudded through the glass like a plea. The little girl pressed her hand to the window. "It's okay, doggy," she whispered, the words fogging and fading against the pain. On the monitor in the corner, heart rate, breathing, blood oxygen, numbers jittered, spiking with every flinch. Dr. Harris paused, eyes flicking to the child, then back to his patient. "Can you talk to him again, sweetheart?" the mother asked gently. The little girl nodded and leaned close, her nose almost touching the glass. "You're brave," she said, as if it were an ordinary fact like sky or sun. "We're right here." Something shifted. The readings steadied by a thread. The shepherd's breathing eased, still shallow, but less ragged. Dr. Harris met the volunteer's eyes and resumed, slower still. Inch by inch, the paint released its grip. It slid away in sheets and ribbons, a chemical skin surrendering to patience and warmth. Where it fell, a grate drank it down, carrying cruelty away in dull rivulets. Outside, the town gathered. Word had spread from doorstep to doorstep, phone call to phone call. Elderly neighbors came in cardigans pulled tight against the evening. Teenagers arrived on bicycles and sat cross-legged at the curb. The hardware store owner brought a standing lamp to brighten the alley. Someone set a thermos of tea on the steps. No one spoke loudly. Conversation sank into whispers, the way it does in a place where prayer might be happening. Inside the bay, the process became a ritual. Oil to loosen, cloth to lift, saline to soothe. The shepherd's coat, where it peeked through, was shockingly beautiful. Deep sable rising beneath the smears, a dark saddle of charcoal, guards' hairs that caught the light like threads of bronze. The more they worked, the more the paint gave up its lies. What had seemed ruined began to look resilient. They paused around the eyes. "Easy," Dr. Harris breathed. A volunteer cradled the shepherd's head, fingers spread to keep the pressure off tender spots. Saline fell like clear rain. The dog blinked, flinched, blinked again, and then those eyes, tired and rimmed red, found the little girl on the other side of the glass. He didn't bark. He didn't move. He just held her gaze like a lifeline. "You're doing so good," she told him, a whole lullaby folded into 5 small words. Halfway through, they discovered a band of leather beneath a crusted ring of color at the neck. Carefully they teased it free. The collar was scored and stained, but intact. Dr. Harris wiped at the metal tag with a gauze pad, rubbing until letters rose from the dull sheen. He read them once under his breath, then again aloud, for the room, for the child, for the crowd that waited with breath held. "Ranger." A hush traveled through the alley like wind through grass. One of those silences that means something has just changed, even if no one can yet name it. The name fit him in a way that made people straighten a little, as if remembering that dignity doesn't vanish just because someone tried to cover it with a mess. "Welcome back, Ranger," the groomer whispered and went to work again. The long middle of the rescue was the hardest part. Pain doesn't shout after a while. It settles into a stubborn hum. Every time they worked at a patch where the paint had seeped deep, the shepherd tensed, trembling in a small ripple that ran from paw to shoulder. He whimpered, low, apologetic, as if he were trying not to bother anyone. And every time, the little girl found a new river of gentleness words could cross. "We've got you. Almost there. You're safe." When his breathing hitched and the numbers on the monitor faltered, she sang, no tune anyone recognized, just the shape of humming meant to say stay. The beeps steadied, and someone in the alley wiped at their eyes. A retired teacher whispered, "I used to hum like that to frighten kids." A young man in a worn hoodie nodded without looking up. "Works for big people too." Paint gave way. Color fell. Beneath it, scars emerged, pale lines along the foreleg, an old nick near the ear, the small constellation of healed punctures on the chest that said he had met hard days and kept going. Someone near the door let out the gentlest sound, half admiration, half grief. It is difficult to see what a life has carried and not feel both. Hours slid. The floodlights hummed like distant cicadas. Shadows grew long and then vanished under the lamps. By the time the volunteers reached the shepherd's tail, what lay on the towels looked like a field of fallen flags. Blue, green, yellow, all of it false. All of it finished. "Last rinse," Dr. Harris said softly, as if announcing the end of a storm. Warm water poured like a blessing. It pooled and rolled off in clean sheets. When they lifted the final towel away, the shepherd stood shivering in a halo of steam, and the whole alley seemed to inhale. He wasn't perfect. No one who had been through that could be, and yet he looked more himself than any of them had imagined. The coat was a river of gold and soot. The muzzle, dignified. The eyes, clear enough to hold a room. The little girl pressed both hands to the glass, breath blooming around her fingers like petals. "Ranger," she said, trying the name as if it were a promise. The dog's ears flicked. He attempted a step and swayed. A volunteer braced him with a forearm under the chest. He steadied, lifted his head, and then, with the deliberation of a knight saluting a queen, Ranger placed one damp paw forward. The town didn't cheer. They simply softened, 100 faces gentled by the sight of goodness refusing to quit. "Let her in for just a second," Dr. Harris said quietly. "Gown and gloves. Then right back out." The door cracked. The mother crouched, fastening tiny gloves on tiny hands, and the father set their daughter down on the mat just inside. The smell of clean fur and warm water rose like a storybook forest. Ranger's head turned, slow but certain. He took her in, the paper gown, the brave eyes, the hands she had held out to him through glass and fear. She crossed the last 2 steps on feet that had learned to be gentle. "Hi, Ranger," she whispered, voice barely a breeze. "We found you." He didn't lick, didn't push, didn't crowd. He leaned, just that, and set the heavy weight of his jaw into her cupped palms. The room was suddenly full of the quiet that happens when people witness something true. Outside, someone finally let a sob slip free, and then another person laughed through tears, and then the alley became what all towns hope to be at their best. A place where strangers hold the same moment in their hands and understand one another without needing to speak. Dr. Harris nodded once, the kind of nod that allows relief. "He's through the worst," he said, voice thick. "He'll need rest. Fluids. Care for the skin. But he's back." The word darted out the open bay and into the gathering, where it landed softly and stayed. Back from neglect. back from humiliation, back to his own name. As the volunteers settled a fresh blanket around Ranger, the little girl stepped back, her work done for now. She glanced up at her parents. Her mother's cheeks were wet, her father's fingers white where they clutched each other. The child lifted her chin, proud and small. "He's beautiful," she declared, as if anyone could have doubted it. No one did. Not anymore. The days that followed were quieter, slower, but filled with a kind of hope that wrapped itself around the little family like a warm quilt. Ranger was no longer the trembling shadow of a dog covered in paint. He was fragile, yes, but he was alive. Alive because a child had seen what others might have overlooked. The vet had given strict instructions: gentle baths to soothe the irritated skin, soft food in small portions, and plenty of rest. The family followed every word as if it were sacred. A bed of thick blankets was made for him in the corner of the living room, right beside the rocking chair where the baby girl often sat with her toys. At first, Ranger barely moved from that spot. His body needed time, but more than that, his spirit needed healing. And strangely, it was the baby girl who seemed to know exactly how to help him. She would sit beside his blanket with her dolls spread out like an audience and begin to chatter in her tiny voice. She told him about her day, about the butterflies in the garden, about the cookie her mother said she couldn't eat before dinner. She whispered secrets the way only children do, in the belief that the world listens if you speak softly enough. Ranger, too tired to lift his head, would let his ears twitch to her voice, a sign that he was listening, and slowly, day by day, those moments stitched him back together. One morning, just a week later, the family woke to find something extraordinary. The baby girl toddled into the kitchen, dragging her blanket behind her, and right on her heels was Ranger. His steps were unsteady, his frame still thinner than it should be, but he followed her faithfully, his eyes focused only on her small figure. The father stopped mid-pour with the coffee pot, blinking in disbelief, while the mother brought a hand to her lips, whispering, "He's walking with her." From that day on, he never left her side. If she played in the yard, he lay in the grass beside her, his head raised and watchful. If she sat on the porch with her crayons, he rested his chin on her lap, as if guarding the very colors she loved. At night, when she fell asleep in her little bed, he curled up just outside her door, a silent sentinel who needed no command to protect. The neighbors noticed the change as well. Where they had once gathered with cautious distance, they now came with gentle curiosity. Mrs. Higgins brought biscuits not just for the child but dog treats wrapped neatly in wax paper. The teenage boy who had run for help earlier stopped by after school, slipping Ranger small scraps of chicken and scratching him behind the ears. Even the old postman, who was known for grumbling about barking dogs, leaned on the fence one afternoon and said, "Fine animal. Loyal sort. Doesn't take his eyes off her, does he?" No, he didn't. Ranger's devotion was quiet but absolute, and the community softened in the face of it. The cruelty of his painted humiliation was slowly overshadowed by the tenderness of his new life, as if the whole town had decided, unspoken, that they would make it up to him somehow. But the greatest twist came when the truth of his past began to emerge. It happened on a Sunday afternoon when the family was out for a walk. The baby girl skipped ahead, her hand clutching Ranger's collar, while the mother and father followed a few steps behind. They passed an elderly man who sat painting on a small easel outside his porch. His brushstrokes were steady despite his wrinkled hands, and his canvas bloomed with the image of a meadow in spring. When his eyes fell on Ranger, the brush froze midair. The paint dripped onto the ground unnoticed. "That dog," he whispered, his voice carrying a tremor. The parents paused. "Do you know him?" the father asked. The man rose slowly, setting his palette aside. His eyes misted as he reached out a trembling hand, though he didn't dare touch until Ranger moved closer on his own. "He belonged to my brother," the man said, voice thick with memory. "My brother was a painter, just like me. A kind soul. Passed away last year. Ranger was his companion, always by his side. They used to sit for hours at the old phone booth on the edge of town. He said it inspired him, reminded him of connection. After my brother died, Ranger disappeared. We thought he was gone forever." The family exchanged stunned glances. And then, like pieces of a puzzle falling into place, they understood. The paint that had once been a cruel covering was also a clue, however twisted. The colors of a painter's life, distorted by someone with no love in their hands. Ranger hadn't just been any dog. He had been a witness to a man's kindness, a keeper of quiet afternoons where canvases told stories no words could. The old man shook his head, wiping his eyes. "He looks thinner, tired. But those eyes, still the same. My brother would have been glad he found you." The baby girl crouched down, wrapping her arms around Ranger's neck. "He's my doggy now," she said softly, possessively, with the innocence of a child who knew nothing about loss but everything about love. The old man chuckled through his tears. "Then take care of him. He's got more to give than most people you'll ever meet." And she did. From then on, Ranger was no longer just a rescue case. He was family. The family bought him a new collar, polished and strong, with his name engraved clearly so no one could ever forget it again. His coat grew glossy with care, his ribs disappeared beneath healthy weight, and the light returned to his eyes. He was no longer a painted shadow of cruelty. He was a guardian, a friend, and perhaps most of all, a reminder that love can begin in the smallest of hands. The baby girl's bond with him only deepened. She learned to toddle with her small hand gripping his fur, balancing herself as much on trust as on his strength. She offered him her toys, her cookies, even the corner of her favorite blanket, believing everything was better when shared. And in return, Ranger offered her protection not just with his body, but with his heart. He barked only when strangers came too close. He stood between her and the street when a ball rolled out of reach. He even tolerated the crown of daisies she once placed on his head, sitting regal and proud as if he had always been meant to wear it. The town, too, changed around them. The old phone booth, once forgotten, was cleaned and repainted, not in garish cruelty, but in gentle strokes of white and gold, a tribute to both the painter who had loved it and the dog who had once waited there. It became a small symbol of hope, a reminder that loyalty endures even when the world tries to cover it in colors that don't belong. And at the center of it all was a child and her dog. She, with her laughter that turned strangers into friends. He, with his silent strength that turned fear into faith. Together, they walked through their little town as proof that healing is possible, that bonds can be born out of brokenness, and that sometimes the greatest guardians are the ones who were once most in need of rescue. Time passed, and the story of the paint-covered shepherd slowly grew beyond the walls of one home and the fences of one neighborhood. It became more than a rescue tale, more than a moment of kindness witnessed by a child. It became a reflection, a mirror held up to every person who heard it, asking them to look closely at the world around them and at themselves. For the townsfolk, the image of Ranger sitting helplessly, his noble coat hidden beneath thick layers of cruel paint, would not fade easily. They spoke of it in quiet conversations over coffee, in hushed tones at church pews, and in retellings around dinner tables. What struck them most wasn't just the act of cruelty that had led him to that state, but the purity of the baby girl's reaction. Where adults might have recoiled, pitted, or even walked away, she had reached out. Her tiny hands had refused to accept what her eyes saw on the surface. Instead, she looked deeper, past the paint, past the weakness, past the suffering, and found the dog's true self. It was a lesson many adults realized they had forgotten: the ability to see with the heart instead of only the eyes. In many ways, Ranger became a metaphor for life itself. The paint that smothered his coat was like the world's cruelties, the lies, the judgments, the careless words, and the wounds inflicted by others. How often, the elders thought, had people covered each other in these layers of paint? Harsh criticisms, broken promises, and betrayals that left colors no one wanted. And how often had they, as grown-ups, simply accepted those layers as truth, forgetting to look for the beauty that might still live underneath? But the child had not accepted it. To her, the paint was only on the surface. Beneath it, she knew, there had to be goodness. It reminded the old men sitting on porches of their own childhoods, days when they had once believed the world could be mended with kindness. It reminded the grandmothers of times when they soothed their own children's hurts with simple words and gentle touches. Ranger was not just a dog recovering from cruelty. He became a symbol of the hope they feared was lost in a hardened world. The town began to change in small ways because of him. Neighbors who hadn't spoken in months stopped to greet one another again. The local school painted a mural on one of its walls, not of flowers or rainbows, but of a proud shepherd standing tall, with a small child by his side. The image was simple, yet powerful, a reminder to the younger generation that compassion was not weakness, but strength. And for the elderly, Ranger's story offered a kind of wisdom that was both gentle and profound. They saw in him a reflection of their own lives. Many carried invisible paint stains of their own, regrets, disappointments, losses that the world could not see but that weighed on them heavily. Yet Ranger's journey taught them that those stains did not define the whole story. With care, patience, and love, even the deepest scars could soften and beauty could return. The baby girl, in her innocence, had reminded them of something they had forgotten along the way: that healing is not found in grand speeches or wealth, but in small, steadfast acts of kindness. A hand reaching out, a voice offering comfort, a willingness to see what others overlook. For the seniors who watched this story unfold, there was something deeply reassuring about it. They had lived long enough to see the world at its best and at its worst, and often they had worried that kindness was fading, replaced by speed, greed, and indifference. But when they saw a toddler save a shepherd not with money or power but with innocence and love, it restored their faith that the seeds of goodness still grew strong, especially in the young. The painted dog, once a symbol of cruelty, became something new in the town's collective memory, a living emblem of compassion and second chances. Just as the old phone booth in another story had become a place of remembrance, this dog, this shepherd covered in unwanted colors, became their shared reminder that appearances could lie, but love always revealed the truth. There was poetry in it, really. The paint that had been meant to shame him had, in the end, transformed into the very reason he was found, rescued, and cherished. What was once a curse became a clue, and what was once humiliation became honor. The people realized that sometimes the very things meant to break us are what lead us to the arms that heal us. The child and Ranger walked together often now, the baby girl clutching his collar with her small hand, and the shepherd moving proudly beside her, no longer hidden by false colors. And whenever townsfolk saw them, they were reminded of the simple truth that innocence sees what experience sometimes blinds us to. The moral of the story echoed far and wide: that life, like Ranger's coat, may be covered in paint, but paint is only ever on the surface. What is real, what is true, can never be erased. Love will always find its way through. And perhaps that is what resonated most with the elders of the town. They understood better than anyone that the world is quick to cover people in labels, mistakes, and scars. But they also knew, after witnessing this, that healing doesn't take perfection. It takes compassion. It takes someone willing to look beyond the mess and say, I see you underneath, and I will not turn away. As weeks turned into months, Ranger's story spread even to nearby towns. Visitors would come and ask to see the painted shepherd, now proud and whole again. Some brought children, hoping they would learn the lesson of looking deeper. Others brought aging parents, who smiled with tears in their eyes, grateful for the reminder that even late in life, hope still existed.